Okay, so the idea behind a summary like this is that I try to speak in broad terms, right? Because the class, in some sense, follows a little bit of a bell curve, right? Where we start off with these broad ideas about the international system, the international structure, what international relations is, right? And then we sort of spend several weeks talking about very specific things, right? Like the balance of power, the nature of the global economy, the construction of an ideational structure, constructivism. And my experience teaching this over the years is that students then start to lose track of the bigger ideas when we do that. So a review like this is sort of supposed to go back to that like 10,000 foot level of relief, right? It's not a highly detailed review in the sense that I'm not necessarily going to go through every concept, every idea, every piece of material we covered. Instead, I'm going to speak in broad terms, right? And when I speak in broad terms, if you're sort of up on your readings and you've been paying attention, you should be able to say, oh, I know what that means. Oh, I know the material that would go with that. If that is not the case, if I say something, you go, I have no idea where we covered that. I don't remember that at all. You should do two things. You should note that for yourself as something that you're going to have to go back to and think about as you prepare for the final. And you should also raise your hand and ask me a question, right? So I want this to be interactive, right? So if I'm talking, you're like, yep, I get that. That's fine. You can just sort of keep going. If I say something, you start saying, wow, I really don't remember that. I don't really understand, or I don't really see how that relates to the content. Put your hand up and ask a question, okay? So one of the things that you should be doing is thinking about how you're going to organize your studying as I'm going through this material. So you should actually be making notes and saying to yourself, he said something about the international system, and I remember this, and I remember that, and I remember this. Those things I probably don't need to spend a lot of time on. But if I talk about something else and you start saying, I don't really remember that, you should be noting for yourself, that's part of the course content. I'm going to have to go back to my readings from that week. I'm going to have to go back to my content and think about it. Okay? So one of the ways that I think is really effective for organizing how we think about the course material is to sort of organize the material into three parallel columns, right? One of those columns is our focus. What we have actually been studying, right? Another parallel column, and I'm going to fill these out, is the theories we have been studying. And then the third parallel column is the examples we've been using to try to illustrate the different concepts and things we've been talking about, right? So our focus in a class like this has always been the international system, right? That is what we want to understand. As international relations scholars, right, we know we deal with a realm that does not have a clear central authority. The realm we are talking about is anarchic, right? It does not have an overarching structure, which does not mean that the behavior of nation states, right, our examples, are not structured in some way, are not shaped by external forces of some kind, are not incentivized in a particular set of directions. So the international system is what we want to study. Theory is what we use to try to make sense of that system and discern what it looks like at any given time so that we can better explain examples. Okay? So, what was the international system? You also learned that the international system is not necessarily something natural. It emerges under a series of conditions, right? So one of those conditions is the Peace of Westphalia. Can anybody tell me what the Peace of Westphalia was?
Right after the Napoleonic Wars, it was the reestablishment of the kingdoms in Europe as well as the establishment and sort of Institutionalization of the nation state.
Close, almost. Dale, you had your hand up too.
No,
So it's the peace treaty that ends the 30 Years' War,
yeah.
which was waged between Catholic and Protestant powers in Europe. It doesn't actually create the modern nation state. What it does is creates the concept of sovereignty. Because basically after 30 years, no one got anywhere. They said, fine, you know what? I'm going to just treat you like you're sovereign. So whatever you do inside your country, I'm going to give up on. You just do it as long as you give me the same respect, right? So you might be a Catholic king. I might be a Protestant king. We're going to drop this whole, we are going to conquer the heathens for God type thing. And we're just going to leave each other be. It establishes the concept of sovereignty, right? Which is one element of the current international system, right? What follows later, remember we talked about these in turn, we get the creation of the modern nation state through treaties like the Treaty of Utrecht and some other ones, right? So one of the things that we want to talk about is we have this system, one of the blocks of which is sovereignty, the Peace of Westphalia, and the nation state, right? So all of a sudden our focus started, we have some units that we want to talk about. We also talked about how this can be organized, right? So if we call this its nature, we can also talk about, and leave myself quite enough room, we'll call it its format. Okay. So if the nature is that we have these units that treat themselves as sovereign, right? And then they have a particular quality. They are nation states, which are defined by a particular nation, a state apparatus, like the monopoly of control over violence inside its territories, Weber's definition, all that kind of stuff. That's the units. The nature of the system is made up of these units. Its format has changed, right? Which means these units interact with each other in different ways at different points in time for different reasons. Okay? So some examples of that, we talked about the Concert of Europe. Anybody remember what the Concert of Europe was?
Was that the part of the history that was immediately following the Napoleonic Wars?
Yes. There we go. Andrew's coming around. So again, so this is another thing, like when I'm going over these, we haven't talked about this for 15 weeks, right? For the people in this room, like even for the online people, 7 weeks, like it's been a while. But it helps to sort of summarize this stuff again. So the Concert of Europe follows the Napoleonic Wars, right? Remember that Napoleon basically was like, I'm going to do what I want with you. I'm going to be the emperor, all of Europe. I'm going to take it. And the states had to organize against him in order to defeat his armies. It's a rudimentary balance of power, right? The Concert of Europe was a formal institution that clarified that. So the leaders of Europe actually agreed to meet in perpetuity to negotiate the balance of power, right? To keep everybody in check. So that's the format of the international system at that time. We have sovereign nation states that have chosen to organize themselves according to the concert system, right? We get a breakdown of that in World War I and World War II, right? Breaks down. And then currently we have, what's our current international system?
The liberal international.
The liberal world order, right? The one that takes over from the Cold War. We can also understand the Cold War as a format, right? Bipolar world where everybody balances on one side or the other. And then currently we have the liberal world order, which is not necessarily defined by the balance of power, even though the balance of power plays a role if you paid attention to Haas. But it's defined by institutions, the rule of law, and a commitment to human rights and democracy. Right? So this has been our focus. We want to understand, right, how these units organize themselves in different ways and why, right? Why did we get the Concert of Europe at one point? Why did we get its collapse in World War I and World War II? Why did we get the Cold War looking the way it did? Why does our liberal world order look differently? Right? Those are our questions that we've been dealing with throughout the semester. How we attempted to try to explain that are the use of theories. Okay? Theories, to be clear, right? Theories are not ideologies. Theories do not exist. There is no realist world, right? Theories are tools we use as academics to explain this. Why it changes, why it looks the way it does, how it might change in the future. They are simplifying devices that try to come to some understanding of what's driving these processes, right? How the nature of the system is or is not reformulating itself at any given time, right? And we'll go quickly over the main ones. We know those. We have realism. We have liberalism. And more constructivism. Okay? Now, it bears mentioning, right? Like I said these kinds of same things when I introduced the concept of theory to you a while ago. It bears mentioning, a realist does not think people are necessarily always violent, ego-driven, right? Their argument is that either A, from a classical perspective, human nature, or B, from a structural perspective, the incentives of anarchy, mean that if we make that assumption, we get a theory that will more often than not adequately explain what we see here. Right? It's a simplifying device. Okay? So what was the simplifying device of realism? Okay, there's the three main elements of realism.
Anarchy.
Anarchy, right? So the system is anarchic. What else?
Self-help.
Self-help, which means it's kind of related, but it means that states are the only ones who can look after themselves, so they must. Third, almost.
Military, top-down.
Not trade, no.
Nation state's the most important.
That's self-help. Stateism, right? Some people would refer to self-help as survival. So the first and only driving factor of a state is to survive, right? Self-help's kind of the same thing. But stateism, right? So here's the thing, right? The system is anarchic, no overarching authority. That means states are up to themselves to look after each other. Themselves. They have to look after themselves, right? Which means they are not going to trust each other. They will not outsource that protection. They will do it, right? And also, because nation states are the only actors that are big enough, strong enough, and have the resources to compete in this realm, they are the only ones that matter, right? So when we want to talk about, we don't have to talk about any other actors, just nation states, right? Now, Taylor, you mentioned a concept that follows from these assumptions, which was the balance of power, right? So what do you get in an anarchic world where states have to look after themselves and that they are the important actors? You get something like the balance of power. States will act in a way where they try to address power imbalances in particular kinds of ways, right? And we have an example of that, right? Which is, for our purposes, the South China Sea. That's an example that illustrates where the balance of power might have some analytical purpose. Is there more to Sino-US relations? Yes. Is the United States and China both representative of diverse, complicated political cultures? Yes. Does it mean that either of those two countries are inherently evil and drive for power? No. That is not what realists argue. Thanks, Christian. Realists simply argue that these conditions mean that they will nonetheless act as if that is true.
Couldn't you say that classical realists would actually say it is because they're acting in an evil way? But it's just like
No, because classical realists don't really necessarily believe in evil, because evil is contextual, right? Realists were interested in sort of the lust for power, right? Egoism is a particular driving force of. There are some veins of realism that talk about evil, but more or less, it actually has its roots in a deeper sort of like theological argument about human fallibility, right? Our nature is imperfect, so we must understand that, right? But structural realism, it's just that these incentives mean that the system's going to be defined by the balance of power, which means that when the balance of power moves or shapes or changes, we will see new kinds of politics. That's where Haas makes that point where he's kind of like nostalgic for the Cold War. He's like, it was stable. Why? Because the underlying balance of power is very clear. Now the balance of power changes, right? States rise and fall. Technology that gives you an edge and allows you to act like a great power on your own 1 minute might diffuse. Everybody has it the next. Think nukes, right? So this changes. So what we can do is we can read backwards, right? So we can take our example. We can say that if we use realism, we look for these considerations. That means that this is like explained by the balance of power, which leads us to where we can make a comment about the balance of power right now. Right? And that's where we argue. Right? We argue about the fit between reality and the theory to try to ascertain how to interpret it. So are we in a moment of transition? Are we heading for a multipolar era? Are we not? Right? How do we define these things? That's where all the muddy consent, like the little nitpicky differences between realists come from. Right? But the broad idea is still the same. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that liberals argue something different. Anybody tell me what liberals argue?
Democratic peace theory.
So you kind of like Taylor, and that's why I think that this like 10,000 foot summary is good, because you did the same thing Taylor did. You jumped from the general theory to one of its permutations, democratic peace theory, which is not bad, right? But it illustrates why it helps before you write the exam to reorganize this a little bit, right, in your head. Christian?
The interdependence between nation states.
That's another sub part of it, right? Danielle?
Is it that like the anarchy and things like that from realism can be overcame?
So liberals are big on we can cope with anarchy. They don't think we can overcome it. Liberals are not arguing that this changes, right? This all stays the same. They're simply arguing, like Danielle said, there are mechanisms we can use to cope with it, right? Which are things like free trade is one of them, institutions, rules. Remember, the liberal international order is a liberal project, right? That's why we call it liberal. The idea here is that we can cope with anarchy through things like free trade, rules or institutions, and a commitment to democracy. Okay. Liberal theorists actually argue that this is actually closer to human nature. We are more like this, right? We want to cooperate with each other. We want to create mutual enrichment, right? Now, to go back again to Gunnar and Taylor, your 2 points, right? Or Gunnar and Christian, sorry. Your 2 points, democratic peace theory and interdependence. Those are particular arguments, right? Remember we talked about hegemonic transition theory, balance of power, right? All internal versus external, all this kind of stuff. That is liberalism's version of that. That's where the theory is, okay, so how does this actually work? How does this actually end up helping us cope with the anarchic system? Liberal institutionalists, the interdependence people, argue it is simply a particular kind of trade. If you are interdependent, right, you will find ways to cooperate because the financial costs of not cooperating are simply too big. It will force you to negotiate and resolve things. right? Gunner democratic peace theory simply shifts the onus of the variable. So whereas institutionalists are big on free trade, democratic peace theorists are big on democracy and the rule of law, right? And they say actually free trade follows from the fact that democracies, because they're committed to principles of rule-based order, right, will find rules, common rules to help organize ourselves, right? And then also our commitment to democracy means that our governments are more transparent to other governments, so there's less fear, right? It can simply be the idea that because we negotiate things in Congress, right, other countries know where we stand. That's not true of an authoritarian government, right? We don't know what's going on in someone's head. So it's the qualities of democracy that make it more likely that states will cooperate, right? So again, and then our example of that, everybody remember? We talked about things like the WTO, the IMF, institutions in general, right? So things like the WTO, these organizations are basically examples of where something like this has happened, right? And these two theories would disagree. Democratic peace theorists are like, we get this because democracies can negotiate to this level. Interdependence people are like, no, we get this because there's benefit, and then the other good stuff follows that, right? We're just differentially accounting, right? And then we can read that back, right? Again, so we have these institutions, we can read them through the theory, and then that gives us a better understanding, or, and what's interesting, a different understanding of how the system functions, right? What's interesting to bear in mind is that liberals argue, and this is kind of important, if these conditions don't hold, we revert back to this. The structural liberal argument is that when these conditions don't hold, we revert back to this. Because we didn't overcome anarchy, we just simply coped with it. So if these institutions start to be degraded, if these rules start to lose legitimacy, if free trade starts to go away, we will revert back to this. Who does that sound like? Legitimacy, eroding, rules, not so clear. Haas, right? This is exactly what Haas is worried about, is happening. That this is going away, we're going to return to this, and this is going to be super duper bad because we've seen it happen in the past, right? World War II. Okay? Now, the last example of a major theory that we covered, constructivism. Does anybody want to, Harold, we're gonna help the online students a little bit because they just did constructivism. So they're still, they're where you were about 6-7 weeks ago. Still kind of, what? So we're gonna help them out. What constructivism, how is constructivism different than the other two theories?
Focuses on norms.
Focuses on norms, which are what?
Shared experiences, interactions.
They come from shared experiences, interactions between states, right?
There's something you just do, like they don't have to tell you to do them.
When they exist, we take them for granted. Some constructivists actually define them as having a moral quality, right? They just feel like you ought to do it. They become taken for granted. But Greg is right, they emerge out of the shared interaction between states. It is still a theory of state behavior, okay? The system hasn't changed, right? The structure is different. Rather than the balance of military power or the nature of institutions and trade, we can call them ideas. Wrong color. See, screwed it up. Ideas. Particular kinds of ideas. Ideas, we call them norms. Why do we call them norms and not just ideas? We call them norms because they are particular quality. They dictate how we view ourselves, define our identity, how we understand the identity of other actors, and the logics of behavior that come from those two perspectives. Right? So, democratic peace theory is an example, right? Because there's also there's a blurriness between these two theories, right? So, democratic peace theory. So use that as an example. Let's talk about a constructivist version of that argument. Okay? For a constructivist, it is not the institutions or the trade that does it. It's that Katie and I are both democratic states. We identify as that. We feel like we ought to act that way. It feels moral, and we're still states, right? It feels like we ought to act that way. So when we have a disagreement, what are we going to do?
go through institutions.
We're going to talk about it. We're going to try to go through institutions. We're going to talk about it because that's what democracies do, right? When I talk about things with you, I'm going to be worried about the human rights and well-being of your people, you with mine, because that's what democracies do, right? Andrew, you're not a democracy. You're an authoritarian country, right?
Can I choose
Um,
which one?
You can pick which one.
I'm sorry.
How am I going to interact with you? If I'm a democracy and you're not, how am I going to think about you?
You're probably not going to think very good of me.
No, I'm not. I'm probably going to think you're untrustworthy. I'm probably going to think that I can't actually deal with you. I have to confront you. You will only understand strength, right? This kind of thing.
So like
Which
China,
means-
the United States.
Well, what's fascinating is that one of the things constructivists bring up is that democratic peace theory holds between democracies, but the most aggressive form of state government or interaction is a democracy and a non-democracy. Democracies are super aggressive with non-democracies.
Believe in peace.
There's actually kind of believe in peace or I'll punch you in the face. Like that kind of the idea, right?
We'll learn about
Um,
this today.
And what constructivists are basically saying is that this stuff exists, but what's really important is not necessarily these clearly definable material things like wealth, like rules, like guns, but the ideas we have about them and what we consider appropriate or inappropriate as a result of those ideas. Those ideas don't come out of nowhere. They come out of our repeated interaction with each other as states inside the system.
Then how does that account for the fact that, like, if I'm Saudi Arabia and she's the United States, like, in reality, we get along actually pretty well. Like, we trade with each other a lot.
Mhm.
You know, we shake hands every day. Our leadership generally doesn't
Yeah.
try and provoke each other.
So
How do you really explain that?
you're right. So like the Saudi-U.S. relationship doesn't seem to make much sense normatively, right? There are lots of different ways to answer that question. One is just the theoretically practical one, which is that none of these theories exhausts the international system. That's why we have more than one and we argue about them. Because none of them are good enough to just simply define, like IR does not have a law of gravity, right? Which is just beyond reproach, everybody accepts it, and we move on. Doesn't happen in IR. Because of that, there are always going to be fringe cases. The second thing is you also have to realize that that definition of constructivism is sort of like the 200 level intro undergrad version, where things are very clear and very specific and divided so that you can get a sense of the theory. It gets more muddy in practice, right? Where norms can actually conflict with each other, right? Our norms about institutions and management of complex problems might lead us to cooperate with Saudi Arabia, but our commitment to human rights and judicial process might chafe with that. It also might be that just our interactions with Saudi Arabia have been more stable and beneficial than our interactions with other actors in the region, like Iran, right? So that's why we prefer Saudi Arabia over other. It's more complicated and it's muddier, right? But the idea here is that it's the ideas that matter, right? It's how states think about the system. And what was the example we used here?
Was it China and the United States?
We talked about China and the United States. The big thing we did was the environment, right?
Oh, yeah, climate change.
Climate change, right? Because climate change represents this problem, right, that doesn't actually sit inside the traditional realm of politics of the international system, but yet it affects the state, so they have to do something. So what do? We try to change the expectations of states. This is something we ought to talk about. This is something we ought to cooperate with. And Pacho Vega gives you that explanation about that's how we would probably move more closely to an environmental order, right? Is this understanding of changing the expectations states have about their behavior. And what's important there is that you get that concept of the norm life cycle, right? Emergence, norm entrepreneurs push an issue, it cycles around, states begin to accept it. After a critical mass of states accept it, it becomes a norm. Once that norm has existed for a certain amount of time, it becomes internalized. So states don't think about it directly, they just do it because it feels like they ought to, right? And that is again, a changing of the system. So you can read it back through, right? Environment, constructivism, ideational structure, and then what does that mean the international system looks like at any one given time. Okay. Good?
Great.
Now, the last thing we're going to talk about quickly before we move on, and I actually show you the exam. My online students have had the exam since the beginning of the class, but that's to cope with my reading load. Now, that's the first bit of the class, right? And then we have this other section. We talked about a bunch of other stuff. We talked about conflict. We talked about terrorism. We talked about the nature of global order. We talked about World Order 2.0, Haas's thing, right? What was that all about? The globalization section. How does that relate? That leads to this other set of questions, right? Where what Haas is basically saying is, and this is where you're gonna talk about this in terms of the final exam. This is how you're gonna answer the questions. These are the questions that you're gonna talk about. These questions about whether the theories still apply. The question is like, are these still actually, does this still actually represent the system? Right? Remember, this is an historical event. This is an historical event. These were historically contextual. They changed. The continent of Europe fell, right? And we got World War I and World War II. After that, we got the Cold War. That fell. We had the liberal international order. It's not immediately clear, just because it exists does not mean it will continue, right? The deeper question that we have is, do these assumptions still hold? Should our focal point still be a world of sovereign nation states whose interactions define the system? Haas's argument is not quite. Some people argue no. And if you take an upper level class with me, we'll talk about some of that stuff. Where, no, these are gone now. That's not actually how the world works because power does not emanate from these actors anymore, right? They emanate from non-state actors, be they terrorist groups, insurgencies, the Apple Corporation, massive, that's power emanates from different sources. So if you want to define global politics, you have to have different focal points. Haas's point is more nuanced. This didn't go away, right? This was World Order 1.0. Now we have 2.0 because the world has changed, right? And the idea is, has globalization changed this? So one of the ways we talked about this is that we started talking about things like state fragility, migrant crises, these new kinds of problems that don't emanate from the interaction between states. They come from within them. Remember, we didn't talk about that stuff before. Our theories are not designed to talk about it, but those are the core issues of our time, right? Wars in states like Afghanistan, which would have not even garnered so much as a front page news story 200 years ago, are now the thing that defines our security politics. Mass migration crises in Europe and here are driven by instability and conflict within states, right? So the question, and which Haas explains in the last part of his text, which you're going to engage with as part of the final exam, is like your final cognitive engagement with the course content, is to grapple with that argument, right? So when he says World Order 2.0, he's adding to this list. There are other things we need to take into consideration, which means we have to alter how we think about these theories. And then our job is to actually use what we've been learning to see how much or how little of that argument we actually accept. Does that make sense? Everybody good? Cool. This one, man.